that little thing, you like the thing, you have to really completely full
theater for everybody, yes, everybody.
That's just what should be done.
And indeed, my understanding of right relationships, just has already changed.
The survival of theater as an art form depends on that.
But there's room for it all. There's room for it all.
Thank you, everybody, to come out tonight to the Martin Segal Theater Center here at the Graduate Center CUNY. My name is Frank Hentschker, and I'm the director of the Segal Center, and it is a great honor and pleasure to have with us tonight Hans-Thies Lehmann. And he's been a teacher of mine. I went to the Giessen school. Actually, I think he arrived the same semester I did after the first year with André. So, and as you all know, he is a heavyweight champion in the history of theater and thinking about the history of theater and combining it into a theory that actually can be applied. And this is what that Giessen school was all about. The success of it would not have been thinkable without André Wirth and Hans-Thies Lehmann, and Hans-Thies' book went around the world. Came with a little bit of a time difference, I think, here to the US, but still in all the many languages it has been translated. It is obviously clear how large and how huge the impact was. And I think maybe Peter or someone also pointed out that normally often theater reacts to philosophy or to art history or to other fields, but this is the idea of the post-dramatic theater came out within the field of theater, and is a very important thing to know. And so we're looking for 2 days. We already had 10 screenings today. We have screenings all day tomorrow, so have a look at the list. It was really the first time that also these significant theater artists have been shown together. There's a little map, the star map of a universe that they're all connected to each other, and not only because Hans-Thies selected them and we also help with it, but also because they represent what we think is truly a contemporary theater, a theater that is closer to the future, that anticipates the future instead of reworking the expected, what we already know, so not just adaptations, but radical inventions. The Segal Center bridges academia and professional theater, international and American theater. So, of course, an evening like this is right in the bullseye of what we are doing, and is very happy to see that you're coming, doing 2 evenings about the same theme. Is very dangerous. In New York, you divide your audience. Sometimes they did not come at all, so it's a great compliment, I think, to us that you come, and also for Hans-Thies that you are with us, and I welcome all the students and all the professors and everybody who came out. I think Elinor Fuchs even came out, even so officially she's here tomorrow. She already came, and also many of our visiting scholars from around the world who are here. We have a little reception here after the evening, so a glass of wine. If you couldn't get an answer to the questions you were asked, you can do that then. It shouldn't be longer than 90 minutes. The format is Hans-Thies will talk about 20-25 minutes about post-dramatic theater and where it stands at the moment, because of course it's still very, very new, and still it's not, it is for some people also, they say we knew about it for 10, 15, 20 years ago, so where is it now? I mean, I met Columbia students who said, Hans-Thies Lehmann, who's that? I've never heard of it, was shocked. And others say, oh my God, this is already, centuries ago, so this is quite a good time to talk about it, why it is significant, why it is important, and why we really should also use it as a model to go forward, as Brecht said, or Heinemuller said about Brecht, using things without criticizing is treason. He said that about Brecht, and I think the same is here. So it's a great honor and pleasure to have Hans-Thies with us. If you have a cell phone, please take it out at the moment and turn it off. After the 20-25 minute talk from Hans-Thies, there will be 3 sessions, 20 minutes each, with the couples which is in your programs, and then we have a Q&A here. Again, really thank you all for coming. It's a great evening here at the program. We are truly honored. Also welcome Peter Eckersall, the EO of the program here, and of course all the artists in the audience. So Hans-Thies, please come and join us.
Okay. Hello. It's a great honor to be here with Frank and you all here, because when we talk about post-dramatic theater today, we must actually go back to 30 years or 20 years ago, when in Giessen we were together, and there was also Frank Hentschker there, and John Jesurun was there, and Molly Davies was there. And this was a great moment. And I want to start by telling you something that you can't know, that when Frank Hentschker was studying with us in Giessen, he came to New York and he found out about a certain John Jesurun. And John Jesurun came to Frankfurt, and then René Polish saw what John Jesurun did. And this was a key element in developing the theater of René Polish, which has now become one of the most important voices in German theater. So this is something, it's great to see how this history is here in the room. Now, when I started to write about post-dramatic theater, it was practically in the end of the Giessen period. And I wrote it, as you say, vor den Gewehrläufen, directly, without a sabbatical or so. I was writing parallel to teaching in the university. And first of all, I would say that I did not plan in the beginning to call it just post-dramatic theater. I thought of a title like this, Studies in the Development of Theatrical Languages, something. I don't dare to think what had happened hadn't I taken this decision to take this title. So that was one thing, that I didn't coin the idea of post-dramatic theater and then was looking for examples like this happening too often in theater studies today. People find out the idea and then they look for proofs of it. No, I was seeing a lot of different theater works which I didn't think weren't really appreciated right by the audience or by the critics. I wanted to give their names and concepts to understand it better. And then there was a second influence on the book, which I think is now very important. It was the director of the Verlag der Autoren, my editor. He suggested that I don't write the long chapters I had, but the short sections that many of you may know from the book. I don't think that the book would ever have had this influence without this structure. So the word post-dramatic theater and also the dramaturgical setup in small units was quite important. Now, when I wrote this, what is the difference to today? Much of what I had written about at the time was, for example, Jan Fabre or Jan Lauwers were absolutely marginal at the time. Had somebody told me at that point, Jan Fabre would one day be the director of Avignon or so, I would have said, you're crazy. Really. And now this is kind of mainstream. So this is an interesting situation for a theoretician, because on one hand I intended the concept to be polemical against the theater that felt all too comfortably secured in the dramatic framework of what they were doing. Representation on stage, meaning It was easily readable for an audience that was united by this meaning and so on. At the same time, however, I chose the title because I think that in fact there's a wider historical dimension to this phenomenon. That was why I started to write the second book. It's not that without a certain responsibility of Elinor Fuchs there. Because one day she used this wonderful phrase, she said, notice what actually is post-dramatic theatre post 2. And then I thought I should write that out. Dramatic theatre, what is it? For most people, this is many people still today, it's a kind of what you call a pleonasm. Dramatic theatre. Isn't all theatre dramatic? No, it isn't at all. So I thought I had written before that, in 1991, I had written about a book about ancient Greek tragedy, where I called it pre-dramatic and said there are strange analogies between this pre-dramatic ancient theatre and the post-dramatic theatre of today. I used the term post-dramatic there in 1991, but nobody cared about it. That's like always, you see, you can't have any idea. If you don't decide to write a book about it, you can't make it visible. So that was the beginning. I thought that the title post-dramatic was not just a polemic term for describing a whole set of different ways of doing theatre different from the traditional way, but also that the European theatre in general is largely defined as dramatic theatre, or should be defined as dramatic theatre since the Renaissance, neither before nor after the end of the 19th century. And this, of course, gives, as Frank already mentioned, a different perspective also on theatre history. Dramatic theatre was a very specific development of European theatre from the Renaissance on. A theatre where people were telling the stories in form of dialogues, making decisions in dialogues and so on. And this doesn't happen in other theatre cultures. For example, in Japan or other theatre culture, you don't have this dramatic structure there, not at all. But of course the European culture was very strong because of a certain imperialism. And so we projected this dramatic theatre model to all the world practically. So if you come to China, if you come to Korea, if you come to Argentina or Brazil, you always find the same style, theatre buildings, operas and so on, with the same names as in European tradition. And this is, of course, today an important aspect of the impact, if you want to call it that way, that the book has in many regions. I noticed that it is taken as a kind of liberation signal from certain traditions and a kind of, call to weapons to find your own way of expressing yourself. So this is theatre beyond drama, may also be theatre beyond representation. although this may be a good point to throw in theoretical reflection there on representation and critique of representation. There will always be representation. There's no way out of it. But you can make differences how it is dealt with. And theater as the end of representation, as the end of drama or so. These are all concepts that I don't believe in. It's like the idea of Derrida, who never said that there's a beyond a representation. So there's a theoretical point for theater to be thought in post-dramatic theater, that is the tension between drama and theater. What many people think as a natural unity is not at all as such, because drama is a limiting factor for theater. And theater always has again a possibility to liberate itself from this frame. There's a theoretical aspect of that, the critique of representation, in the way I qualified it now just for a little bit. And then also there's a theoretical, there's a historical dimension. Now in the beginning of 21st century, we have a radicalizing of all these questions, I think, because up to this point of what I just said, you can always think it within the aesthetic realm in general. All of these are questions inside the aesthetic dimension. But we have now a situation where many artists feel they have to interrupt this aesthetic dimension, go into the real, go into document, into game playing, to something that is not aestheticized. This makes it, of course, complicated and more difficult for us to judge. The task of the critique has become much more complex now, because there are no longer any standards whereby to measure. I just think now of some examples that may, as an end to this introduction, makes this a bit visual for you. For example, we have here an artist, Uwe Mengel. Uwe Mengel started in the 80s with the practice of theater, where people didn't impersonate the figures. They didn't play a story or anything. But the audience came into a shop, and there were people gathered. The people was the cast. And there was a criminal story supposedly had happened. And you went in and went in and had conversations with these people. So there would be the father of the victim, for example, or friend of the victim, And they had studied this story in terms of things that were going on in a certain quarter of the city. So you started with them talking about it. So everybody got the theater he was earning for himself. You might say, this is something that is no longer art, but I think this is an interesting borderline. Or when you take Rimini Protocol today, with people who are cast as German as they are there, and they tell about their lives, about their profession, about their ideas. Also, where's the art then of directing? But the art of directing is there. It's just the attempt to keep these people from making a fool of themselves. Because when you are not a professional, you are asked to be on stage in front of audience, you're always in danger of making a fool of yourself. So they help them. I think that the political dimension of theatre has changed its face a lot. In the 70s and 80s, many people still believed we could teach something about politics by the theatre stage. Today nobody will believe that people on stage are smarter about politics than the people in the audience. If they had solutions for political problems, they would have gone into politics and realized the solutions there. But of course, theatre remains a political art form, I think, by the way it is done. It is a communal work. The utopia of theatre is, I once heard somebody of a group say, the conference is that we do something together. That's it. I think that the political dimension of theatre is there today. This is a dimension of practice which is possible to do together. And this, if you want to say it, put it like this dramatic way, democratic aspect of theatre is much more important than the messages you may try to give by your theatre. The social dimension of theatre is happening in the performance, by the contact between audience and performer. Nothing else, nowhere else. It's not in the thinking about the things he said to you, or something of the sort. It's just the moment of communication that is happening. theater is not in the first place something to be understood, but something to be shared. It's like telling a joke. If I tell you a joke, you look back at me like this, and you say, I've understood the joke. Something went wrong. I think that's a model of aesthetic communication. It's not about understanding. The understanding is there too, that something else is happening. And this is also interesting to see if you look a bit closer to the classic tragedies. Here there's a moment of anagnorisis. Some of you may have heard that's a moment of recognition. Aristotle identified as one of the great moments of affective reality in theater. But this word anagnorisis, it's a moment when Oedipus says, oh wow, 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 the whole comes out now. It's me I was searching for. Now, this is not a knowledge, this is anagnorisis. It's a moment of insight, where suddenly he notices what is going on. And especially what he notices is that he didn't notice it. So, theater is not a place for bringing knowledge from one place to another. Not at all. It is a moment of such insights, which may be comic or tragic, but which are like the telling of a joke or the sharing of a sad moment of somebody you love. I think that many of these aspects of theater practice have been lost in the business and also in the academia. In the business, because people are used to be sold something. They want to buy something when they go to the theater. So I want to buy something like a meaning, knowledge, identification, but not this moment of a passing insight which is lost again. The academia, of course, is even worse in that respect. Theater studies. In Germany we have the word Theaterwissenschaft. It's a bit heavy. Woff, woff. Theaterwissenschaft, theater science. It's already better you talk about theater studies, because it doesn't apply this systematic aspect. But if you want to have masses of students write papers for you, of course you give them a system where they can then say, okay, this is the insight, this is the knowledge, this is the definitive point. I think that in Giessen we at least made an effort to do things differently. I remember that René Polish, for example, once or twice in his interviews, he said explicitly this, that he liked about the teachings of Wansin Lehmann there at the time in Gießen was essentially that we didn't try to tell them what they should do to have success in theater, but to find out what they have to say. This, of course, takes time. And today's study programs are, on the contrary, directed toward effectiveness and speedy finishing of studies, which I find is wholly unproductive, because a young person who's going to the theater should first of all have a chance to find out what's in him, and then only try to share it with others. I like to think of theater as an offer that you give to people to share an experience with you. You don't have to share it, but there's an offer to do it. This may be a kind of closing statement.
Yeah, and I think in the good old Giessen school tradition, instead, what would have been easy and also fascinating to have Hans-Thies speaking longer. The idea now is truly also to share and bring some of the artists and the collective researchers and colleagues together. And I think we could go to the first panel. It would be like 20 minutes, 15 to 20 with Uwe Mengel, John Jesurun, Molly Davies, and on new forms of theater. You already mentioned Uwe's contribution, but I would like to invite all three of you to come up. Where's Molly? Over here, yeah. So please do come here, yeah. And Uwe and John, and let's talk for a moment about new forms.
One more chair. One more.
Oh, that was beautiful. I even took notes. I never take notes. That was beautiful.
So,
I don't think we need the table.
For snacks.
thanks.
Looks more professional with water. Yes, yeah. Yeah.
All you do is use it.
You're seeing theirs, right? Okay.
Do we need a mic, actually?
Yes, it's recorded also, and also to hear better.
Okay. Okay.
So, new forms of theater, and maybe you all talk a bit about your work and how it relates to Hans-Thies Lehmann and where you see your connection.
Why don't you start? Well, I think Molly should start.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, I
Yeah.
do because I just
Can you do the mic a bit closer?
Molly,
Yeah, John is a big technical expert.
yeah, really, I
here.
don't know what this is. Is this a microphone?
It is.
Thank you.
It's not a camera.
It's not a camera. But I think Molly was really one of the first people at Giessen, really, weren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, Thies, it's just such a pleasure to see you and be here. It changed my life. I was a filmmaker, and I was living in Stuttgart and did a show in Frankfurt at a place called Theater am Turm. And André Schwiert saw the piece, and he came afterwards, and he said, "We'd love you to teach at Giessen." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "It's a Theaterwissenschaft," and I couldn't imagine what that would be. I said, "Look, thank you so much. I was very honored, but I know nothing about theater." He said, "That'll be perfect." So I said, "No, you don't understand. I didn't finish college. I never was even in a school play, and I know nothing about theater." And he said, "Well, we're interested in doing something about Beckett." And I was so nervous, I said, "I know nothing about Brecht." He said, "Not Brecht, Beckett." And the great thing for you all, that I assume a lot of you are graduate students with Frank, and this idea of openness, that's what that was about. Andrés was completely convinced that the idea of opening things up, and as you said in one of the chapters, I like the smaller chapters because of your book, but one was cool fun, I think, and about opening that up outside of the whatever is traditional, whether it's dramatic or post-dramatic, and this whole idea that what it is that you want to do. And I had about there, I don't know if there were 12 or 15 or however many students there were, because to my enormous surprise, in Germany, you don't actually have to go to class. Who knew? I was so pissed off once because nobody was there, and then everybody was really apologetic. They said we had to go to a lighting thing at the theater in Giessen. And I said, well, I came on the train all the way from Stuttgart. So you goddamn well better be here if we're going to make a piece. But everybody made something. And that was, Andrés and Thies never, there were absolutely no restrictions. And since, it was terrific. We had a terrific time in Giessen. I mean, it was fabulous. René Polish was, I was particularly fond of René because he was just so weird, and his English was very odd. So I asked him to do the Maladie de l'amour in English, and he said, I don't act. I said, oh, come on, René, just get up and do it in English, which of course made it interesting. And he was, he and Frank, I mean, about 6 or 7 of these people that happened to be there who taught me a lot. Let me tell you, this was, you guys are really helping whomever your instructors, teachers, professors, whomever comes here. You're really helping them a lot because they're lost in time and space. I can tell you that right now. Isn't that right, Frank? You're lost.
Very much so, yes.
And I actually wrote notes down because Thies, I thought it was so terrific. But the there was something that reminded me of this separation and giving things space in language. Was it reminded me of John Cage and Merce, who were separating the dance from the music and giving each artistic dimension some place to breathe around it. And actually, John quotes Kant about saying that there are 2 things in life that for which you don't need to understand, and that's music and laughter. And when you talked about that, about laughter, I thought about that because they just give you pleasure and you don't need to understand them, you know. And that idea of it being the political as a communal gift is could not be more important now. No preaching, no knowing more than somebody else, no battering somebody with your political ideas, but just being open.
That's good. That's exactly the point. It was already in the way we choose the students
Yeah.
at the time.
Is that right?
Yeah, it was not the point that they did something in theater before.
Yeah.
Whatever they did, one was doing music, another one was doing a video clip, third one was doing something completely different.
Yeah.
And we chose them on the spaces, always.
Well, I don't know that I've ever been with a more fun, more interesting group of people. And you brought that on to Frankfurt too. That was that continued. I mean, it was completely open.
Uwe, just for you, Hans-Thies talked a bit about also your work. How do you see your theater connected to Hans-Thies's book, and was it there before? And
no, I don't know if it was there before, maybe at the same time. I don't know. I think sometimes you are lucky in life when there's certain situations which basically challenge you, if you feel the challenge. And I think that was the situation in Gießen in the early 80s. When did you start in the 80s, kind of? And also when I started doing this kind of what I still call interactive performance, but now the official title is participative. It changed, but it's still the same. And that was the early 80s in New York. So I'm a little old, you get the age, kind of. And it was the most amazing time in the art scene in New York, because you were really kind of, people really pushed themselves to the limits, in my opinion, and much more, you have the same experience, much more open-minded in a certain way. And you went to unusual places to create your performance. I think that's the most important thing. I grew up as a child basically with theater, blah, blah, blah. The big German theater where you have opera, blah, blah, everything and so. What I most enjoyed was the restaurant within the theater where all the performers were. Because it's the most amazing thing to see Hamlet sitting there playing cards, you know, till he is called on stage. So this really intrigued me in a certain way, and I was always searching for ways to leave the stage behind. And Hans-Thies mentioned that the worst part for me is audience participation. This is, thank you for bringing that up. It's really the worst part. You sit there and say, and you, yeah, of course, you mentioned it, you make a fool of yourself. And when I say people, oh, I do this, yeah, but in my performance, everyone's completely free to come, to go anytime you want. You can come back, whatever. You can talk with the murderer, you can talk with the wife, you can talk as long as you want, you can ask any question you want, and so on. So it's a special way of creating this, and that's how we basically connected. I remember, actually, I never thought, I was invited to Gießen, so, but since I'm an artist, I'm also prone to depression. And when I did this participative performance for the first time, that was in the South Bronx. And you might heard about the South Bronx in the 80s, that was hell. But there was a very famous gallery, Fashion Moda there, and everyone was up there, Keith Haring, Basquiat, everyone showed up there in this hellhole, so to speak, and that's why I created this performance, and it got them basically, and then André called me and said, you should teach at Gießen. That's when I started. But somehow I spent a few months in the hospital with a depression, so it never worked out anyhow. But I'm very grateful for Hans-Thies Lehmann's understanding of my work, because that basically helped me. I mean, when you say to people, I'm doing this type of work, still at my age, a lot of times I have to explain it. It's not self-explanatory, so it's kind of, it's very interesting. So when I was in Mexico City or whatever, Melbourne, I say, why don't you read Postdramatic Theatre? I'm in there. Oh, you're in Postdramatic Theatre. Thank you. So thank you very much for that. It's a big help. It was help with sponsors and so on and so on. It's really wonderful if you travel over the world and invited to festivals. You're in Postdramatic Theatre. So that really helps. And it also helps. It's translated into many languages. So that's really kind of, it's kind of in my situation, it's a big help. And what you just said, I would like to say that basically my problem is, we just discussed it in Berlin, is I'm using now some politics behind what I'm doing. Kind of, you go to my performance, obviously you talk about a murder or something else or whatever, but behind are the politics. The problem is I cannot help it, but I'm interested in politics. But the problem is, if you do it in theater, it's kind of you're preaching to the choir. That's the problem. You know, I mean, I can be as much as I want against, no names, but say, okay, just capitalism, whatever. The people sitting in front of me, they are the same. So that's a huge problem. You know. And so I try to avoid this also by confronting people with people they would not usually not talk to. I just did this performance a while ago in Germany, and you might have heard about that. There's this huge right-wing party in Germany, AfD, Alternative for Germany, and they're getting more powerful by the day. And all the people who go to performance and theater in this town, they don't know anyone from the AfD. So I created a character for one of the performers who was a member of the AfD. So basically you sit in front with this person, and if you don't ask questions, nothing happens in my performance. So you have to talk. And so all of a sudden they were confronted by someone who was a member of the AfD in his character. So as an audience, all of a sudden, I'm challenged. So, and of course, there's a certain way of training the actors. I would not say, you can also say rehearsing. But that's it. So basically, I don't want to make it too long. Kind of.
Yeah, maybe before we go to a question to John, Hans-Thies said earlier he looked what's out there and then tried to put it together. So in a way, your work was out there. I know you also asked me, Frank, do you have a PDF of the book? And I said, yes, I'll send it to you. So what does post-dramatic theater mean for you in a book or to your work?
Well, the book, I mean, I just also have to sort of bring up this period of time that we could say that post-dramatic theater was starting to form itself. Because at the time that really Giessen started, I think it was a reflection of what was, it was the feeling of what was happening in the world already. So, there was the East-West. Germany was the site of the wall that was starting to split. People could feel it, whether they really knew it or not. That was starting to split. You could also say the internet was actually just beginning in a very few short years. This strange thing called the internet was going to come about. All this other political things, sexuality was opening up. All these things were just right in that small period of time. And so I think in a way this post-dramatic theater was kind of sensing all of that, and that was all feeding into what post-dramatic theater could become. Also the media, all this, that was really the center point when the media was just starting to show its real power. Really, right before that in the 70s, nobody really had too much of an idea, except maybe a few social scientists somewhere who were really paranoid. But still, so I think it was all, a place like Giessen was kind of a focal point. And interesting, again, that it happened in Germany of all places. I think it didn't happen, let's say it was happening, could be happening in different parts of the Western world or whatever, these kinds of ideas. But actually it really was kind of focusing there, and it was that Hans-Thies was the one who really started to notice what is actually going on around here. It's not just sort of another trend or another thing flying by, and to notice these questions. So I do remember being in Giessen, and it was either the first or the second time I was there, but I do remember that you asked me that you wanted to meet with me and talk to me about my work in a very serious way. And of course, André was around, but André had a different way of talking about your work, and I thought, oh my God, now I'm going to have to, so I better get together. This guy has the real questions, and he wants real answers, in a way. So that was great. So that was kind of an education for me. I thought I have to. And then, of course, I was actually, pleasantly surprised actually that I had some answers, but I was induced to give them in a way. So that is was what is a great part of that school, is that it was able to pull these questions and answers out of people and get their minds working. So being there was a great education for me. I mean, I was supposed to be there as a teacher, and I'd only started making theater 2 years before. And suddenly I was there as a, this guest professor or something. But, so it was a real education for me. And I do think that Hans-Thies, he was already contextualizing all of these things in the things that you would say, the questions you would ask. And it was kind of an interesting type of communication with you, because it was, you were so curious about everything. All these things, what are you doing? You weren't dismissing things or pretending that you knew things about it. There was curiosity. And so I think there was a great curiosity that actually got transferred to a lot of those students. Students were very curious. Yes, we bring up, Renee Polish, very curious mind, a very impertinent kind of mind, So curiosity to stretch out in all different creative directions. And so I don't know, for me it was that was really kind of a focal point, which as time went on, I thought, oh my God, this is kind of a pivot here. There's actually something happening, and we seem to be part of it in this little town that you brought me to. And I mean, that was the other thing. I have to say that these students were somehow had this idea that in Frank's thing, he tried to sneak into one of my performances in New York in the East Village and pass himself off as a journalist. Yeah, somebody said there's some German kid here who says he's a journalist from Germany. And the place was completely full. There was no seats left. And I looked over, and there's a very young, thin kid. And I just said, oh, just let him in. Let's see what happens. And so I was quite lucky to just let him in. But the students were encouraged to act upon what they were thinking. That was the other thing. So in this case, Frank saw something and he acted upon it. He invited me. André invited people. You invited people. You asked questions. So it was this idea of really acting upon what you were doing, not just thinking about it. Yeah. Thinking about it was actually daydreaming in a way. So to act on this. So anyway, that was.
Yeah. So I think something is a pivotal. I think something did change, but we are a bit pressed of time. Maybe Hans-Thies, just as a reaction to what your colleagues say. We can't go on much longer because we have the next panel. But Hans-Thies, what comes to your mind listening to these comments?
Comes to my mind that also our work on theory was not destined to interact directly with the art. But we studied, let's say, on one seminar we did Deleuze or something on its own right. And I think that it's a mistake that is often made now in theater studies. People try to mediate too quickly between theory and practice. But this is the way. So being curious about what is happening in the theater and being curious about thinking they should both have their own way. And then you can have, if you're lucky, then it will work something between them.
Well, thank you, and thank you for joining. Hans-Thies, you may be seating, but I think I'm going to ask for the next panel. I think we're out of time, but thank you for the practitioners to come and join us, and we thought it was important to open with them. So thank you, really, for all of it. And André and Bertie, maybe you come and join us.
I'm out of that business.
Thank you, John. It was very good.
Oh, you got it?
was very good.
Oh, good. Thank you.
And now we come to what we say the performance in the age of performance, a title Peter Eckersall suggested. So maybe we move in a way a step ahead. None of you have been there, but still your work is connected in some way to Hans-Thies' work. So maybe give us some of your reflections.
Go first.
Sure.
So my work, because it was interesting to hear how you first encountered post-traumatic, I have to say, first I studied with Rebecca Schneider as an undergrad and discovered a little bit of theater out of theater, kind of performance. Then I went to performance studies and studied with Richard Schechner. Then I came here to the PhD, and it was only when I graduated that Frank was like, because I was friends with Frank, you know, there's a book that was just translated, you really need to read this. So it was only after I graduated with performance studies, Rebecca Schneider, and PhD that I finally read your book. And I always wonder, why had I never been taught that book when I was either in performance studies or as a PhD? And I think this is kind of where my work is, and kind of the intersections of disciplines, because we were talking about everything you were saying. I felt like, oh, I wonder if live art from the UK. I was thinking of the Live Art Development Agency and Lois Caidon. I was thinking about an essay I read that Andy Horowitz wrote on contemporary performance versus visual art performance. I was thinking about how you include so much dance, and how now there's, you were saying mainstream, there's like this market of kind of post-dramatic theater / live art. So, and how this has become disciplined. So this is where I'm interested in. What's the post to the post? What's new? Because there's definitely, you go to all the festivals and it's the same kind of artists that you're seeing. So now with the internet, I mean post-internet, digital, YouTube, I'm curious to see what the next generation is gonna do. And I think one more thought before you speak maybe is that also with current performance art, how now theater is really infiltrating the museum, the gallery spaces. This is not something new, obviously, but it's now at least theater history is being taught in graduate visual art programs. And I think this is a little bit different than perhaps Black Mountain College, you know, always kind of that history of experimental. So maybe, just as an example, my nephew went to Cooper Union, and one day he comes and he's like, oh, I'm gonna do this really great contemporary art piece. It's on puppets. Have you ever heard of the Peter Schumann? I was like, yeah, I've heard of Peter Schumann, yeah. And so what's new, you know, in one discipline is like this reinvention. But I think these things perhaps are emerging in the more conversations we have across disciplines. And so this is kind of where I'm interested in. When do we talk about live art versus performance studies versus post-dramatic theater? Just to open it up in that way.
So, well, first of all, thank you, Frank, and thank you, Hans-Thies, for inviting me to be here. It's a great honor to be in this beautiful theater. And so in terms of dance, this is what I'll be talking about, because it's my field of study, but also, I guess, between more or less 86 and 98, I was working in Europe and working as a dance dramaturg, which was something that actually was completely unheard of, except in one of the examples that actually appear in the book, which is to think about how Pina Bausch would be one of the artists that would be included within the post-dramatic theater. So, so from that position, both as a dramaturg, as a dance scholar, what I have to say is, and also someone who teaches in performance studies at NYU, it seems to me that it's very clear from not only the intervention early today, but also from your talk in performance studies last week, that we had the pleasure to have you talking a little bit longer. And what's very clear is that how the notion of post-dramatic theater, as you said, is not an invention that you come up with, but it's actually the expression of a concept that emerges immanently from the practice of the artists that are surrounding you. And it's as if, like, all of a sudden you give the name, or you express the name that of a condition that is already being there, and it needed to be named. From the point of view of dance, that becomes really, really important, because throughout the 80s and 90s, the choreographers in Europe that we're working with are facing this ongoing accusation that they are killing dance, and what they're doing is not dance. And something that your book proposes, and you mentioned this today, is that it's not post-theater, it's post-dramatic theater, right? So the equivalent for all of a sudden for a whole generation of choreographers and dramaturgs is that, oh, it's not that we're not doing dance, we're doing post-choreographic dance, right? There was dance before the invention of choreography, there will be dance after choreography, right? But this moment when you say that the dramatic theater is invented in the Renaissance, coincides with the invention of choreography also. The first time that the word appears is in 1589 in a French book, Orchéosographie, right? And 100 years later, in 1700, finally we have choreography printed on a book, right? So it's a formation of a new discipline. And in the 80s and 90s, all of a sudden we have a group of choreographers, more or less in different generations, with different concerns, different ideas, that are interested precisely in questioning the choreographic within dance, just as perhaps some dramaturgs and theater directors are interested in questioning the dramatic within, or drama within theater. So I don't read German, but I remember distinctly when the book came out, maybe simultaneously or a few months later, there was a short essay by you published in Ballet International, Danse Actuelle, called Postdramatic Theatre, which is maybe 10 pages or something like that, which was a summary of your arguments. And when that fell within the realm of those who don't speak German, it was really like a moment of insight that somehow validated what we were doing and allowed to give us a little bit of energy. I was working very closely with Meg Stewart at the time and with Vera Montero in Portugal, and with other choreographers, and I remember distinctly the audience yelling at these choreographers, saying, "Dance, why don't you dance," right? And the reason that they wouldn't dance is because precisely they were questioning the imperative that is always attached to the choreographic machine, right? It's precisely this imperative to move, right? And they were questioning that. So that was these two aspects, like to create a concept out of the practice of the authors that surround you. I think it's exemplary for scholars and for theorists, and we should all do it. And on the other hand, this proposition that there is something that is pre-dramatic and post-dramatic. And then like this alignment between, let's say, how it was very, very curious for me to see that many examples of the post-dramatic corresponded to what perhaps in dance we were calling dance theater, right? So, and that made me rethink the condition of theater somehow. When you, because I believe Meg Stewart is there, and in the book, and Anne-Therese Kiesmacher, and many others. So that was very, very important. And let's see if I think I had one last point, but now I can't remember. Let's see. I guess that's it for now. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's very moving even to hear this. Because, of course, dance was always in the theater important, and there was this artificial separation between speaking theater, dance theater, and opera, music theater in the German tradition and the European tradition. And I think to find back theater must first of all also mean find back dance. Of course, also the idea that language and music is not separated, like in the ancient Greek word musike, which included language, poetry, and music, and rhythm, and everything. And I had a chance to collaborate during the last years a little bit with Jan Fabre. And it was a great experience because I hadn't expected his work to start to be as it was. I thought he's a dictator who says do that and that and that, nothing of the sort. It was the group that developed the ideas. Then he would select, of course. And dance theater, like Jan Fabre, is of course completely different from dance theater, let's say, of Max Stewart. But I love both. And I don't think that there's any reason to be dogmatic about this or this question. I have the feeling that, like it says in the Bible, my Father's house has many rooms, or something of the sort. I think this is very true for the theater today. So I feel that mostly the people who are attacking avant-garde theater as dogmatic, they are really dogmatists who say theater has to be like this, everything else has to be justified, particularly.
And it's quite interesting also in relationship to what you said of theater in the museum. Just as a brief, it was the last thing I wanted to say, but I didn't write it down. But in relationship also to that, I just was in Miami this weekend, and they were showing Tino Segal's This Situation, and what was really, really interesting was to think about how in the room, you walk into a room, and then in the gallery, and in that gallery there are 6 people who are, 2 of them are actors or dancers, but we don't know, and then the other people are professors, right? Specialists in Foucault and like really high theory people, and within that space they create a little possibility of an encounter. And I was just thinking about, it's a theater without character, but it's a situation. And they say, one of the things that Tino says is like, maybe theater is just another name for a situation in which we have to be engaged in what happens to you at that moment somehow. So.
It's really interesting. I didn't know that, because I had this concept was very important for me in post-dramatic theater, to say a situation in a sociological sense. A situation starts in a birthday party, when the second person arrives, and it ends when the second last person goes. In between there's a situation. And I think this is...
No, I was just it's funny that we're talking about situation, because I was gonna talk about, well, the comment I had was on when you were speaking about dramaturgy, and that in your book you mentioned, dramaturgy of a situation, alive in a situation that's kind of orchestrated in time and space, as a durational component, and this kind of merging of disciplines. Again, one essay I wrote, I remember reading Claire Doherty's book called Situation, and I thought, I can't believe it. She's talking about situation, coming, I guess, from visual art and more dance. And has she never read post-dramatic theater? That's just what kept coming. So maybe it's a time and a place where these kinds of dramaturgies from different disciplines are more re-becoming together a little bit. Not sure. Institutionally, maybe.
I would like to include there also visual arts and cinema, because we always had the theater, film, and media studies together in Frankfurt. And I think it's extremely important that people who study theater today, they know a little bit what's going on in the cinema and in the visual arts. So there should be a lot in the museums. And also we did, for example, in Frankfurt there happened the first great exhibition about Stanley Kubrick. They were very angry in Berlin that we did it in Frankfurt. It was a really great exhibition, and we were collaborated with it. So students were doing little performances on subjects of the films within the exhibition, which was quite interesting. And I think this collaboration should be intensified today between museums and performance and theater studies, because sometimes you just don't need anything else but a room in a museum and a painting or something, or an object and the performer there. And then you find out new things.
Good. I mean, if not, you know, we'll a bit on sketch. We also want to have really time with the audience, you know. So really, thank you for coming and contributing, and leave the microphone on the chair. So Sandra, really, André and Bertie, thank you for coming. And we all know these conversations could go on for much longer. Hans-Thies could have spoken longer, and our three artists, Molly and John and Uwe. But I think it gives a little insight or inspiration, and you can go as deep then as you want. We now have Peter Eckersall, who is the executive officer here at the program, Australian professor of theater, specialist in Asian theater, but also in dramaturgy, and Melissa, who just also finished her studies here, and to see what did this book mean in Asia, in Asian theater, and in dramaturgy in general, but also for the Asian theater. What does it mean?
After me, okay, sure. Hi. So when I was asked to speak at this panel by Frank and Peter, I was thinking, oh, what am I going to talk about? Because when I think about my own practice and my own research in theatre and performance, I never framed it in terms of the post-dramatic. So the question to myself was, I'm wondering, why do I not frame it, through this term? And I realized it's because it's so naturalized in the way that I think about theater. I was a theater practitioner in the 1990s in Singapore, and I became a scholar of theater in the mid-2000s till now. And I realized that the work that I've been doing and the work that I've been writing about are all post-dramatic in nature. So I've read about the book, but then I don't think about it as a term to think about the work, because I guess it's the way I think about theater in general. And then I started thinking, for the purpose of this panel, why is there such a prevalence of post-dramatic theater practices in the spaces of my study, right? So I write about theater practices, performance practices, interdisciplinary performance practices in post-colonial spaces, Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. And so my hypothesis is perhaps it's because these new city-states have a lack of how would I say this, a canon of traditional narrative performance text, right? So how do you think about new histories? How do you perform a new nation state into being if you do not have these canonical a text to look back on, right? So how do you perform self and being? How do you perform new history? So thinking about new dramatic forms, for example, might be a good way to think about it. So so if we think about the post-dramatic as a form of presence, as a situation, as a moment, are these theatre practitioners rethinking or relooking at traditional theatre practices, right? So that would be, I guess, my main hypothesis. And another thing that and to kind of carry on from this, I'm also thinking in terms of scholarship. Could we actually look at if we look at a performance practices with a post-dramatic lens, then perhaps we can move the conversation when we think about comparative practices of Western theater forms and Asian theater forms, moving the conversation away from the intercultural framework to thinking about these practices to be in conversation with each other and thinking about them in terms with a transnational framework, right, rather than an intercultural framework. Yeah.
Thanks, Melissa. I think I'm trying to remember, but I think I've only ever met you twice in Europe, but I've met you about 5 times in Japan.
Yes.
And I'm going to speak a little bit about my understanding, at least, of the reception of your work in Japan. Before I do, though, I'd just like to briefly mention the 2 times that were in Europe, because I think they were certainly very important for me. The first one was that I was very fortunate to attend a symposium that was made in Holland, in Amsterdam, organised by Marijke Hugelman to celebrate the translation of post-dramatic theatre into English. And there was a 2 or 3 day symposium, and there was this wonderful presentation by one of your graduate students who was really sweating, I remember, who had to give an explanation of the theory in English for this international audience, and it was very insightful, and the whole conference was really exciting. The second time was some years later when you organised what was probably the best conference around dramaturgy that I think has ever been held in Frankfurt, and it was in the early 2000s, and it produced the publication and with several very notable essays by people like Mary van Kerkhoven and your own essay, and that was a remarkable event for bringing together some of the key dramaturgs and academics working in the field. Quite extraordinary, and you know, I consider myself very fortunate to have been there. And I guess the segue to Japan is that, at least as far as I can think, there's a connection between the reception of the post-dramatic theatre and dramaturgy in Japan. And I think one of the interests that they've always, that Japanese scholars have had in your work is very much exploring that connection. And so I think it was Hirata Eiichiro who wrote the first book in Japanese on dramaturgy called Dramaturgie, which was very much a kind of German history of dramaturgy. He's a German specialist who works at Keio University, and I think at one stage he invited you there as a visiting scholar. And then later on I met you in association with Takayama Akira and Hayashi Tatsuki, who are two theatre makers, and very, again, I think strong connection to Giessen there through Takayama's work, and Takayama is, of course, working a lot in Germany now as well. And they work in, well, Takayama mainly. I was just told that Hayashi's actually moved to the south of Japan and is just bringing up a family and has given up performance. That was quite news to me. But Takayama, of course, is very, very busy in these days. And I think his work relates to post-dramatic theatre concept in so many ways, because it's relating to concepts of the theatre of the real. But also his training in Brecht and his training in dramaturgy is very much a part of his and I think the German school of dramaturgy, if we call it that. And then you were also part of a very extensive project organised by Fuji Shintaro at Waseda University. So moving from Keio, which is one of the big prestigious universities, but very much associated with a very kind of conservative education, to Waseda, which was one of the main sites of the 60s activism and the biggest theatre program in Japan. And Fuji-san organised a year-long symposium on questions of contemporary performance, post-dramatic theatre and dramaturgy, of which I remember I met you there because we were both speaking at that seminar. The Japanese, they have, for many, I mean, for centuries, they've translated everything. They're avaricious translators, and very often translating books from non-English language into Japanese before they translated to English. They translated Antoine Artaud before he was translated into English, and they may well have translated the post-dramatic theatre before it was translated into English. Half of it, yeah.
It was really the first translation that was ready, was the Japanese.
That's right, yeah.
It was 4 years or so earlier than the English translation, even the French.
Yeah. But, you know, there is that kind of tendency to translate and that thirst for knowledge. But I think there's also not only intellectual in Japan, but also the contemporary artistic community find a lot of resonances in the kind of work they're doing, particularly after the 1980s and into the present day, with people like Okada Toshiki, who are doing work that is in some respects post-dramatic, but in other respects, of course, there's always been a post-dramatic theatre in Japan. So many of the characteristics that append to Japanese, to your the concept of post-drama or have existed in Japan for a very long time indeed, centuries in fact, but in different contexts. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's of course a very special relation between Japan and Germany in this respect, because on the other hand, Japanese theatre was very influential in the beginning of 20th century in Europe and Germany, because all the avant-gardists, they loved the Asian theatre, they loved Charlie Chaplin. It was about the only thing they could agree upon. They were all for Chaplin and for Asian theatre. And I was very happy in Japan when I was there, because the first time I went there was with a theatre project of Hamlet Machine, 1992 I think, or 1991 it was. It was a friend, an Austrian director named Joseph Seiler, and he had an invitation to work there, parallel to a Japanese who was putting on stage Hamlet, to do the Hamlet Machine. And we sat together in Vienna one day, and as Joseph Seiler saw us, he said, I'm going there. I said, oh great, I would like to be there. He said, well, why don't you come? I said, yes, of course, why don't I come? But a few days later, or a few weeks later, I received suddenly a fax. At the time it was still fax communication from Tokyo, Goethe Institute, if I wanted to come there on a conference on this project. I wrote at once back that I won't take the long flight to Japan just to attend a conference. But if they would host me for a few weeks so that I could see some theater, I would come. They did this. And so I became a fan of theater, which I think is really a great invention, theater historic.
There's also just one other thing that I was thinking about, the use of post. John was speaking about the kind of age of postmodernism, post-dramatic theatre, but in Japan there's also the concept of the post-shingeki, which was a theory developed by one of my professors, David Goodman, who shingeki is the Japanese word for the modern drama, and so he proposed the concept of the post-shingeki referring to the 60s theatre, the very radical avant-garde of the 1960s. And so that term post-shingeki is an interesting sort of parallel to the idea of the post-dramatic. And I know when they translate post-dramatic theatre into Japanese, they use the katakana, so it's Postdramatic Theatre. It's not post-dramatic engeki, but there's an interesting, I think, mirror or some kind of parallel kind of discussion around the very active 60s theatre and this idea of the post-shingeki.
Also, there's a kind of deep divide. How many intellectuals think that politically left theatre must be realistic theatre in the Engeki tradition. So they were very skeptical about the no forms, the radical forms of post-dramatic theatre. But I think that meanwhile this has changed. there's no connection.
Yeah, I think the word mirror, but as you moved, I think it is one of the perhaps great function of the book, that it did hold up a mirror in a way, Hamlet's mirror, that the theater father has died, and you look in yourself, what do we do now, and that it really mirrored in so many forms and reflected also. More light perhaps came out than even you put in, so it was just a brilliance in it, in the sense of the word. I would say, since we are at 8 o'clock and we don't want to go overtime too much, maybe we open up to a few questions. Maybe since we have so many participants, maybe just to Hans-Thies. I think we have 5-10 minutes, so maybe put up some light to the audience. And I would like to thank Melissa and Peter to give a little idea of an idea, how profound the influence really was. And again, thank you all for participating, and I hope you will be able to join us tomorrow. We need a good audience, and we need good theater, but we also need good audience, and it's fantastic to have such a great audience with you here. So some comments or a question for Hans-Thies. We have the microphone again, not only that we hear you, but it is also being recorded.
Hi, hello. Thanks for coming. I'm a student here at the PhD program, and I like the offer of thinking about theater as a joke. I connect to that very much. And I wanted to ask, as a theater scholar, is our job to explain the joke? In other words, how do you relate to the joke, to that aesthetic communication, I believe you called it, aspect as a scholar?
That's, of course, a question that you cannot answer generally, I think. Why? You can write about theater by taking a step away from it or going very close to it. Mostly academic discourse remains in the middle distance. We don't find out anything. So you can go into the details, or you can go to the theoretical dimension of it. And I think the second no, let me put it in another way. I think with a joke, with aesthetic communication, it's the same thing. You can relate to it in forms of theory. For example, if you take the Freudian theory of the joke, you find there exactly this model. Which says when you tell a joke, and then you laugh with the laughter in the end, when you have told your point, it's a kind of Zündung, how did you say that? Initiation between the subconscious of one and the other. That's the aspect of the element there. And I think that with Lacan, you have a possibility to theorize this mechanism a bit wide. It would, however, be too difficult to explain, I'm afraid now.
Thank you. Another session comment?
Hello, this is really a pleasure to meet you. I've been knowing your work for some time now, and I wanted to ask about the place of the text in post-dramatic theater, as we talked a lot about dance and performance, installation, and how much, and of course the importance of artaud in this, what we may call maybe a tradition now. What would a post-dramatic theatrical writing look like as a practice? I'm thinking there are some writers, I believe, that could somewhat fit in that category. Like I know well the work of Valère Novarina, for instance, the French playwright, somebody who writes beyond, representation, or is it writing as a form of performance. I wanted to know if you would just comment more on this.
I would love to, especially since I constantly have to fight the misunderstanding. Post-dramatic theatre would be theatre against the text, which is of course nonsensical. Where to start? There are texts by Friede Jelinek, by René Polish, by Sarah Kane, by a number of other authors, which are great and which correspond, in my opinion, exactly to the post-dramatic style or mentality or whatever you want to call it. So there's obviously a number of great writers nowadays. I don't mention Rainer Müller, of course, because it's so evident. So, on one hand, you have this dimension of authors who write in the post-dramatic way. On the other hand, you have a lot of text work. For example, in forced entertainment. You know forced entertainment, certainly. Wonderful theater, one of my absolute favorites. However, it's really textual theater. It's text theater. So I think the function of text in post-dramatic theater is just as essential as it was in dramatic theater, only in other ways. And I feel that I'm happy about much post-dramatic theater because it's liberating the text as literary phenomenon from the reduction to a role text.
Thank you. Another one or two more, some comments or thoughts? No. I think we'll go on if there's. We will also have tomorrow. Maybe you will stick around. We have a small reception also here, and we are also already a bit over time, 10-15 minutes. So really, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Hans-Thies, of course, for doing all the way here. And thank you.